Yes, there is something I want to ask you.
All right.
How the f*** do you write so many books so fast?
What's shaking? My name's Cam. Welcome back to another video. Before I say anything else, I just want to make it very clear straight away. This is not an anti-Stephen King video. I'm not going to be talking about his past controversies or taking some kind of elitist stance of Mr. Stephen King is much too antiquated for my tastes. This is more a conversation about how and why the king of horror continues to thrive in a genre that, compared to others, bears very little fruit. Also, obviously there are a lot of other successful horror authors. I'm not saying there aren't. But let's be real, if you're a horror fan, then I'm sure you know better than most that the bar seems to be set much higher in this genre. I make weekly videos about fantasy and horror. Deep dives, reviews, video essays, so if that sounds cool to you, my guy, pull up a chair. I've been a fan of Stephen King for a really long time, pretty much transitioning from R.L. Stine as a kid into Stephen King when I was growing up. Like pretty much every other person who has ever so much as dunked their beans into the waters of horror fiction. But to be honest with you, I have to admit, I don't think I've ever crossed into the borders of being a die-hard fan of any of his books, and it's probably for that reason that his venture into fantasy, The Gunslinger, was one of my least enjoyed books, kind of ever. Personally, I've always had much more of a love for his ability to tell a short story, because I think in a lot of cases he has this great idea for what has the potential to be a really scary story, but then it gets bloated out with so many extra pages that it's hard to stay invested. Now, this obviously isn't always true. He has many good novels. It's almost a taboo in the book community to refer to book to film adaptations as anything less than inferior to its written counterpart, but another huge reason that I like Stephen King as a creator is how much of his work has impacted horror media at large, not just books. But I'll get to that in a bit. I don't think Stephen King is undeserving of his title as the King of Horror, especially when it's such a great play on words. Are you kidding me? But I would be lying if I said it doesn't make me at least a little bit sad that we don't see other horror authors taking up more of the spotlight. Let's discuss it. You need only go as far as booktube to see Stephen King's cultural influence. To be honest, I think it's gotten to a point where King is so synonymous with horror fiction that his influence is now more about him as a person rather than his actual books. There are countless booktube channels that generally stay away from horror, maybe only going so far as thrillers, but will have multiple videos about their Stephen King collection, which isn't a problem, by the way. That's completely fine. But this is proof in itself that when it comes to horror, most people need only look for one name. The major bestseller lists will rarely share their recommendations of anything spooky unless a new King novel is out. Lucky for them, he releases a book in between every bathroom break. On the rare occasion a new Hollywood horror film is announced, there's a good chance it will be based on a Stephen King story. Seriously, the list of films or shows based on his writing is insane. Needless to say, if horror had a face, it would be the strong jawline of this guy right here. But why? I have a theory, and perhaps I'm way off, but I think it comes down to a serendipitous circumstance of timing and trends. Stephen King rose to fame in a time when horror was much more socially relevant and competitive, thanks to the advancements in cinema and television in the 70s and 80s. Paired with their rebellious culture shift of the era, we saw the rise of the incredibly popular slasher films. Rather than the more introspective and some would say nuanced takes on spookiness, we got flashy monsters and colourful gore. This taste for blood spanned not only the screen, but also books. This was the golden age of print media, including horror magazines, comics, and trade paperbacks. This was the perfect environment for authors like Clive Barker, Dean Koontz, and of course the man himself, Stephen King, to flourish. Despite everyone always calling me a boomer, I wasn't actually around at the time, so I can't personally say why Stephen King took the crown of horror over the other horror authors. I'm sure there's plenty of debate about it, but the point is that it was so competitive, at least compared to today. Perhaps it's due to his dedication to keep pumping out new books consistently, a habit he's kept up even to today at 73 years old. I think that because of this, he managed to stay not just relevant, but a foundation of the horror genre. My theory about why he is the main name in horror has to do with that relevance directly. Stephen stayed relevant through the decades, through the changing trends, and managed to come out the other side into a new age. An age where, unfortunately, horror is a bit more of a niche. I can't say for sure, but I believe the reason Stephen King has such a monopoly on horror fiction is because he kept releasing books until he existed in a time where it's much more difficult for horror authors to do so. In a traditional sense. Don't get me wrong, if we include self-publishing, it's never been easier, but that's a whole other conversation. No one can compete, even other established authors. Pair this with the fact that most traditional publishers already don't see horror as a viable or profitable commercial option, and you get what we have today, the Empire of King. It's not that I want to see Stephen King fail or that I think he's overrated, it's just that I wish we could see some of that King hype shared with newer and more unique voices in the genre. Because if we call it for what it is, he has a monopoly on popular horror fiction at the moment, and I don't blame him, I blame the publishers that refuse to show some faith in the darker side of storytelling. So if you are an active horror fan, you've probably been sitting there shaking your little fisties at the screen, saying, what about the horror authors that are successful today? And of course, they exist. I've made my theories and my thoughts around Stephen King pretty clear by now, so why don't I put my money where my mouth is and talk about the others? First of all, ironically not as far from King as you would expect, is his son. Nope, not that one. Yeah, that's the one. Joe Hill. Joe actually happens to be my favourite horror author of the newer age, with such gems as Heart-Shaped Box, Horns, The Fireman, or his incredible horror short story anthologies, Strange Weather and Full Throttle. I would go so far as to say I enjoy his work more than his dad's. Controversial, I know, but he has a writing style that just gels with me a lot better. Joe's writing style feels a lot like a mysterious stranger in the back of a bar, in the shadowy corner, telling you a gruesome tale or a local legend. He doesn't write nearly as much as his father, but I hope in the future he is remembered just as fondly. Steering away from Stephen King completely now though, I promise, is okay, well, it's another Stephen Graham Jones. Now, Jones isn't a super new name in the genre, in fact he's been around for a while, but his popularity has actually been skyrocketing in the last couple of years, with titles like Night of the Mannequins, Mongrels, and The Only Good Indians. His 2012 book, The Last Final Girl, is actually really good as well. I have a strong feeling that Mr. Jones is going to get even more popular in the horror community as the years go on. And that's really exciting. Deviating entirely from Stephen's and King's now though, I would like to point out that a lot of the horror I read is actually from independent or small press publishers. I love indie horror because it's cheap, it's really quick to read, so usually there's not a whole lot of commitment you have to put into it, and you genuinely can find some absolute gems from time to time. For example, Spider Season by Billy Hanson, a personal favourite of mine. Sometimes you'll see these books pop up on Amazon for free or on discount special for like 99 cents, so it's always worth giving it a try. So there you have it, my thoughts on the Empire of King. I obviously really appreciate what he has done for the horror community, the industry and the genre at large. Hell, I have a tattoo dedicated to a movie based on one of his short stories. He's easily one of the hardest working men in the world, and I think as far as his writing is concerned, he's earned every ounce of his success. But I do hope for a future where we can see different horror authors smashing onto the bestseller lists. Not just for the book side of things, but imagine all of the fresh new adaptations we would get as well. God knows the horror film scene is looking about as barren as the Australian outback right now. Anyway, let me know what you think. Do you think there's any other horror authors who could realistically take a shot at the crown? Thanks so much for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. I really do appreciate it. Thank you. See you in the next one. Catch ya.